have the end of the boycott. Uzbekistan is celebrating it as this huge victory over the critical international community as well as over forced labor, which has been around for a very long time. It seems to us, watching Tashkent up close, that the Mirziyoyev administration looks at this as a done issue. But it will take a lot of work to maintain the status quo, right? So what are the challenges that Uzbekistan faces now, not to, let's say, go back to where things were 10 years ago?
Right. Well, I think, first of all, I think it's springtime now in Tashkent. As you can see, we're standing out here outside. And to a certain extent, that is also a great picture for what's happening in Uzbekistan now. The winter's over. It's the end of one story, but the beginning of another. And I think what people are celebrating, you said the end of the boycott, but I think what's really worth celebrating is the end of child labor and forced labor. And that is really the focus of the ILO, is the end of systemic child labor and forced labor. We are in a position now where we can declare Uzbek cotton is free from systemic child labor and forced labor. What's critically important for Uzbekistan is that it capitalizes on this political victory. Uzbekistan has seen a number of political victories: the GSP Plus status with the EU, the GSP status with the UK, the end of the US Trade Representative Labor Review of Uzbekistan, the upgrade in the TIP report, and the lifting of the boycott by the Cotton Campaign. These are political victories, and they're important for the country. But now it's time to seize the economic benefits and the victories in terms of job creation, in terms of economic growth, in terms of attracting trade and investment into the country. And that's really where I think the Uzbek government, the Uzbek industry, the Uzbek trade unions should be focusing and are focusing their attention right now. And this is also where we, as the ILO, are looking to support them.
What would it take for the Uzbek government to ensure that the forced labor related practices won't come back?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. And I think it's a question that many people are asking themselves, including the brands and retailers who are now looking to do business with Uzbekistan. What are the risks of backsliding? And I think if you look at what happened in Uzbekistan, is that they actually addressed the root causes of the problem. And the biggest root cause of the problem of forced labor was the state order quota system for cotton production. It was the fact that government officials were involved in the cotton production, in the cotton industry. And that has been changed, and that has been taken away. And
has it been changed like systematically, fully?
It's a process that takes time, of course, but the legislation around it, the system whereby the government issues production quotas for provinces, for districts, for farmers, that system has gone away. And I think this is really the key. Keep the government officials out of the cotton industry, because the problem with forced labor is when people in authority, in a position of authority, are part of recruitment of cotton pickers. That's where the risks of forced labor are. And as long as the government keeps these reforms going and makes sure that the private sector is running the cotton industry, I don't think that we are going to see any backsliding, any return of forced labor in the cotton industry in Uzbekistan.
Will you continue monitoring the practice, like every cotton season that's to come?
So what we have done, we have been monitoring the cotton harvest since 2013 for child labor and since 2015 for child labor and forced labor on an agreement with the World Bank, as you know. We have been training independent civil society activists. We have facilitated and helped them establish an organization that's registered, that can 17 independent civil society activists that can continue to do monitoring. They're using ILO tools, ILO methodology, and we have involved them in the analysis of the data. On top of that, the labor inspection, we have helped the labor inspection grow from 200 labor inspectors to 400 labor inspectors, and I think in the future we're going to see even more. The labor inspection is now issuing an annual report with data that people can take into account as they make policy decisions or business decisions. The ILO has been in existence for 102 years, and we've been in Uzbekistan for 30 years. The ILO is not going to leave Uzbekistan. We're going to continue to be here. I think our role as monitors will change, and we will help facilitate the next stage of the reform process. But we're handing over the monitoring to independent civil society, to the labor inspection, and to the national monitoring conducted by the Federation of Trade Unions.
Okay, so we know that the Federation of Trade Unions is still not independent. We also know that there is no real civil society in Uzbekistan. And we know that the government still is the main sort of force in this. how are you going to deal with those challenges? What are you doing to make sure that civil society, trade unions, and other actors evolve and develop and become more independent?
I think I beg to differ a little bit on what you just said. So the Federation of Trade Unions are operating a legal clinic where people can contact them and ask questions and get answers and get guidance and support. In addition to that, they're conducting national monitoring where they're sending monitors into the cotton fields. And they produce one report. The Labour Inspection has the mandate to enforce and investigate cases and issue fines and submit cases to the justice system for criminal prosecution. That is something which the trade unions, of course, doesn't have. The Labour Inspection is doing their part. They're investigating cases, they're following up, and they're issuing fines and submitting cases to the prosecutor's office, etc., etc. And civil society, on their part, is going out independently. And one of the things that we have been monitoring very closely is, are there any signs of control in terms of what can the civil society activists do? Do they have access? Do they have the right to do their monitoring in a way that ensures that the results are independent? And they have that freedom. So there's going to be multiple reports, and that's the same in any country in the world. You have multiple sources of information, and you take all that into account when you form an opinion, when you make a policy decision, or when you make a business decision. And I think that's the stage that Uzbekistan is at now.
Yeah, but you know, in Uzbekistan, what we have seen is that they have functioned better with your support, you know, with your assistance. Now, if you decrease your role and pull out a bit, the independent human rights activists who've been serving as monitors and those other independent actors in Uzbekistan, by losing your protection, your support, their role may get diminished because the authorities may start pressuring them or harassing them, because that's sort of the trend in Uzbekistan, right? When the monitoring of the international community decreases, the authorities increase their role and their leverage over these actors. At least some of the human rights activists I have talked to say that it's great that the boycott ended, it's great that the ILO has been successful, but they don't want you to decrease your role in any way. They still want your support and assistance.
As I said, we're not going anywhere. And let's see. I understand why you're asking that question. I understand where some of these concerns may stem from. But let's give Uzbekistan a chance to prove that things have changed. And we will deal with issues as they come. There are a number of international organizations that have monitoring requirements in their contracts, in their frameworks. For example, the World Bank. For example, the EU with the GSP Plus framework. And other governments, other international institutions.
And they all need local partners.
They all need local partners. They all need independent monitoring. So this is not like the focus and the attention is going to be removed from this. And there will be plenty of people keeping an eye on what is really going on. We, as I said, are not going anywhere. We will be focusing our efforts on enterprise level engagement. We will be focusing on ensuring social dialogue at the enterprise level, ensuring decent working conditions as Uzbekistan is looking to position itself as an exporter of textile and garments.
Do you think that the Uzbek government realizes that this is an enormous responsibility to its own people and in front of the international community? Now that the Uzbek government seems credible in terms of ending and fighting forced labor, that sustainability of this progress is a major task, right?
Yes, absolutely. When I speak to government officials, when I speak to trade union officials, when I speak to textile clusters and private companies, absolutely. Everybody is aware of the responsibility that comes with this progress. But you know what? I actually think that the Uzbek government, to focus on the government for a minute, I think they are credible. They have delivered. They have ended systemic child labor and forced labor in the cotton sector in Uzbekistan. And this is something which didn't happen overnight. This was a process. And I believe when I speak to people, this is not something that Uzbekistan did to lift the boycott or to please the international community. This is something Uzbekistan did for itself. and the responsibility and the accountability ultimately lies with the Uzbek people and the citizens of Uzbekistan, and how they trustworthy the government is to its own citizens.
The practice of forced labor in Uzbekistan has a long history, and obviously this was the major fundamental violation of the labor rights of the Uzbek people. Uzbekistan doesn't have credible labor rights unions or trade unions. You said that earlier, that the Federation of Trade Unions of Uzbekistan has evolved, and they're doing a much better job perhaps than they did 10 years ago. But what can the ILO do to advocate, to push for real independent professional labor unions in this country that can be seen as independent parties that are really lobbying for the rights of the workers?
I think I'm optimistic, and one of the reasons I'm optimistic is that during the 2021 cotton harvest, we began to see an emerging trend of, I guess you could call it, democratization of the labor market in Uzbekistan. For example, the minimum wage for the first time in 2021 was set through a tripartite consultation. So it wasn't just the Ministry of Finance saying this is the minimum wage. There was a consultation of the trade unions, of the Ministry of Labor, and of the Employers Association. And I know that the trade unions of Uzbekistan argued and lobbied for higher wages for cotton pickers. So this is a positive example. Secondly, we also saw an emerging trend of collective bargaining at the brigade level. So what we basically observed is that cotton pickers came together and bargained collectively to get better wages, to get better working conditions. And it is working. The majority of cotton pickers were paid more than the minimum wage in the 2021 cotton harvest.
So did that increase, did that evolve year by year?
The minimum wage has evolved year by year, but it's the first year that we see this tripartite consultation, and it's the first year that we see this trend of collective bargaining. And these are very positive trends, which I think should be nurtured and developed further into, further tripartite negotiation, further representation of workers, collective bargaining, and freedom of association. Yes.
So Uzbeks are really happy that the boycott ended. Of course, they wanted this for a long time, but it came at a really critical time. The war started in Ukraine, Russia invaded Ukraine, and Russia is now facing endless sanctions, which are going to ultimately impact and affect this economic system, this labor market. Uzbeks have millions of migrants in Russia. And the government, as you and I know, is really afraid that majority of those migrants will return, and this will create economic and social tensions here. What can the ILO do in this context, in this increasingly complicated picture?
Yes, so I believe we have an important role to play, and we stand ready to play that role. Basically, what we're seeing is a very large number of Uzbek labor migrants from Russia returning. That, of course, comes in addition to the fact that the ones who are remaining in Russia are paid in rubles, the currency is plummeting, and maybe some of these migrants are not even able to wire back the money back to their families.
Yeah, and they can't. I mean, we've been talking to them, and they're struggling already.
They're struggling already, exactly. In addition to that, because of the boycott of Uzbek cotton and textiles, Uzbekistan has, for obvious reasons, developed Russia as a major export market for textile and garments. And that market is disappearing as well. So you could say that Uzbekistan is being hit by the sanctions from multiple angles. And I think what we can do as the ILO is to address, first of all, there are many things we can do, but address the vulnerability that comes out of labor migrants returning, money not reaching families and local communities in Uzbekistan. There's a vulnerability that comes with that, and that vulnerability comes with a number of risks, labor risks. And we in the ILO are used to dealing with these type of risks. We can address these through awareness raising campaigns, strengthening regulations and laws and enforcement mechanisms. So that's one place where we can help. But what we can also do in the ILO is to help Uzbekistan develop the textile and garment industry in a way that is credible and gives assurance to brands and retailers, international brands and retailers, that they should begin to place orders with Uzbek textile.
The kind of companies that were part of the boycott.
Exactly the same companies, exactly. And I have had, I told you before, every week one of these companies call me they're interested in Uzbekistan, they want to explore the market, they want to explore sourcing opportunities from Uzbekistan, and I think what we can do as the ILO is something that we have done in many other countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, many countries around the world. We have something we call the Better Work program. And this is something we've been discussing with the industry, with the Uzbek side for over 1.5 years already. We will be establishing a Better Work Uzbekistan program where we will focus on establishing social dialogue mechanisms at the enterprise level, at factories, at textile clusters in Uzbekistan. We do assessments, we do training, we do capacity building, and we put in place these social dialogue mechanisms which gives international brands and retailers the confidence that Uzbekistan is a market that they can explore from a commercial perspective.
Uzbeks are impatient, as we see here now. They are desperate for investment, just like many other countries, and they are facing a tight time frame because these migrants are returning. The industries want to sell their products, they want to export. So what kind of timeline we're talking about here? I know that pretty much every company that you've been talking to they don't want to go public. They don't want to really, express their will or their interest in Uzbekistan publicly or through media. They're sort of doing their intelligence work now. They're doing due diligence. They want to study this market. They want to study the system. What would it take for the Uzbek government to, let's say, convince them as quickly as possible to come and start doing that business? Because this is a matter of days now. This is not really a long-term goal for the Uzbek government. They want it now.
Yeah. I can't speak on behalf of any international companies, but I can tell you what they tell me when I speak to them. I think over the next month or two, we will begin to see an influx of delegations from these companies. They're going to be relatively discreet. They want to assess the capacity of the industry in Uzbekistan. They want to assess what's already in place. They want to identify partners. I think we're going to see that happening over the next, let's say, 2 to 3 months. What we're doing as the ILO, we're currently undertaking a feasibility study for our Better Work program, and we are going to accelerate this. And my understanding is that we can accelerate that to the point that in Q3 or Q4 of this year, we are ready to initiate operations and support the sourcing operations in Uzbekistan.
So the spring is a critical period. If they were to gauge, right?
Yes.
And Uzbeks have been having investment forums. They definitely want potential investors, to come and find out more about the opportunities here. Obviously, any challenge also creates opportunities, and the challenge for the government, of course, is to be able to identify those opportunities and seize them. In your conversations with the government, do you see that realization? Do you think that the Uzbek government is being strategic enough to identify those openings, for example, with Russian markets closing, or with Russia being more desperate for the products that they can't get from anywhere else? Do they see those windows of opportunity?
Yes, absolutely. I think you're right. I mean, Uzbekistan didn't have a choice. When the boycott was in place, the cotton campaign boycott was in place, they obviously were limited in their ability to develop relationships with those companies that had signed up to the boycott. So I think the Uzbek government and the Uzbek industry did what was natural, which was to explore alternative export markets. Now I think the realization is definitely prompted by the sanctions, you could say, and the status of the Russian economy is such that the timing with regard to the end of the boycott is a good timing, in that now is the time to engage. When I say Western, it's not only Western, there are also global international brands and retailers, and I think that opportunity is the top priority for the government, for the industry of Uzbekistan.
Uzbeks are very much interested in joining the World Trade Organization. There have been some high-level visits to Washington, and the United States says that it's committed to help Uzbekistan to enter this organization. How critical is the situation regarding the labor rights or labor freedom in Uzbekistan, economic freedom overall, in that process?
I think there are many different processes going on, and the one you describe is a longer-term process. And I think in terms of attracting foreign investors to Uzbekistan, that's a much shorter process. Labor rights, labor conditions is critically important in that process. It's about credibility, it's about assurance. Western international brands and retailers have zero tolerance policies on child labor, on forced labor, on violations of fundamental rights and principles at work. And the Uzbek industry needs to provide mechanisms to make sure that the sourcing companies have the confidence that there are no systematic labor violations in Uzbekistan any longer.
Mm-hmm. So that'll be considered when Uzbekistan is negotiating with other countries or with other members of the World Trade Organization?
You can look at this issue from a countrywide perspective. That's very much what we have been doing with the ILO third-party monitoring. We conducted 11,000 interviews for the 2021 cotton harvest. When you look at this from a nationwide, industry-wide perspective, that's interesting from a policy perspective. But if you are a brand or a retailer looking to potentially place an order with an Uzbek company, you will be interested in the performance of that company. Of course, you will take the background environment into account, the overall status of the industry, but more importantly, you will be focused on your business partner, the company that you're doing business with. What is the performance of this company? What kind of management systems do they have in place to ensure that there are no labor violations in their operations or in their value chains? So I think this shift away from a nationwide sort of a perspective into the enterprise level perspective, I think that's really what's going to be the trend over the next year or two. And going forward, there's going to be much more focus on enterprise level interventions, enterprise level monitoring, auditing, assessment, and so on and so forth.
If the Uzbek government came to you, maybe they have already come to you with that request and say, assist us, help us in the process of negotiations or overall entering the World Trade Organization, what kind of assistance do you usually offer, or do you offer that kind of assistance at all?
So ILO, we offer the same assistance to any of our member countries. We assist not only governments, but also employers and worker representatives, trade unions. We assist our tripartite constituents in any country we are in to strengthen the labor market, to make sure that international labor standards are adopted and embedded into the national legislation, to ensure that the enforcement mechanisms are efficient, effective, and to basically provide, I guess you could say, credibility and a level of assurance to international players that the labor market is well governed and well functioning.
Uzbeks want to improve the bigger picture, or want to be seen as improving in the bigger picture, and they want to maintain that narrative that we are on our way to improve the human rights conditions in general, and the improvement in labor conditions and labor rights is a huge progress as far as they are concerned. What are some other players here that we need to keep an eye on? You know, obviously the government, obviously the whatever civil society is there in this country. One of the conditions that we heard from the cotton campaign was that Uzbekistan must register NGOs, must register human rights organizations that have been trying to get registered, and there is a pipeline, as far as we know, of those organizations. Do you see that Uzbeks will get aggressive on that? Do you think that there's enough political will in Tashkent to register those critical human rights organizations, some of them led by the former political prisoners, for example?
Yes, absolutely. I think we can point to the fact that Asam Famanov, that we've been working with for a number of years, who used to be a political prisoner, is now registered with his own organization. Sukrat Ganiev, another independent activist that we've been working with for the last 4 years, is now registered, his social enterprise. And he, in fact, this is the enterprise that have conducted the 1,000 qualitative interviews for the ILO during the 2021. So there are good examples already. I think it's a process, and I think we're going to see more registrations going forward. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. You also have to see the civil society having the capacity to actually run organizations effectively, to run organizations from an HR perspective, from an administrative perspective, funding, operations, credibility, all of these things. It takes time. I think the clear signal that I'm receiving from government officials, from civil society activists here in Uzbekistan. Everybody wants to see this happening, but there's also a realization that it's a process that takes time. It has to take time in order to be credible, in order to be sustainable, in order to move everybody forward.
Do you have any programs to empower local organizations that advocate for labor rights, for example, specifically?
Yes. So what we've been doing specifically is we have a network of 17 independent human rights activists that we have been working with closely for years. And we've been working with them to enhance their understanding of international labor standards. We've been working with them, we've involved them in the design of our methodology, of our tools, our questionnaires, and all the different, instruments that we use for the monitoring. We have involved them in the analysis of the data and the formulation of the recommendations and the report. And that capacity, that ability to take international standards, apply them independently, make sure that the data is collected in a credible way and analyzed and reported and communicated in an effective manner. I think that's part of that capacity building that is necessary in order to attract funding, in order to attract interest from civil society. Nobody is going to just give you money because you are a you exist, you're a civil society activist. You have to be able to add value, to play a certain role, and that's what we have been working on with these activists, and we are happy to expand that circle and include others. Make sure that you actually play a role, that you add value, and then I think the funding and the partnerships are going to flow naturally from that.
Thank you.
Thank you.